the Atlantic Council and its experts, its different centers, are tackling this crisis, or responding to this new moment with our expertise and our message of cooperation with allies. Europe has been obviously at the center of this issue, and this is why we at the Future Europe Initiative, in cooperation with the Global Business and Economics Program, have been at the forefront of analyzing and providing policy solutions to this issue. We had a panel last week on the impact of the virus on the European Union. We will have this afternoon a call with the ambassador of Italy and the European Union to discuss what we can do as a global community to respond to this new and unprecedented challenge. So I'm very happy today to introduce my friend, Senior Fellow, Atlantic Council Senior Fellow, Bart Oosterveld, who will moderate this conversation. Please engage with us on Zoom, on Twitter, ask questions that the moderator will read during the conversation, and stay with us for the next 45 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben, and welcome. Thank you, everyone, for dialing in. Let me start by introducing the speakers. We have Alexis Crowe, who's the lead of the geopolitical investment practice at PricewaterhouseCoopers, and also a fellow here at the Atlantic Council. And then from Rome, we have Andrea Montanino, who is the chief economist of CDP, one of Italy's foremost financial institutions, and also a fellow here at the Council. As Ben said, we encourage questions. You can ask them via Zoom with the chat function. If you're following us on the Facebook stream, you can type your questions into the comment section and they will be transmitted to me. It looks like from the initial data from China that we're in for a global recession later this year. Some rough preliminary numbers indicate that the real economy in some parts of China dropped by some 30–40%, with a drop in the retail sector of up to 80%. And many economic forecasters as a result are now forecasting a recession in the US, in the EU. And there's a wide uncertainty around this forecast and around these estimates, but they're tilted to the downside. Legitimate fears of an actual depression. And the stock markets are finding it very difficult to price the bottom of the current circumstances. And I think one of the reasons is that the public health imperative for social distancing, prolonged social distancing, implies a prolonged shutdown of the economy, or paralysis of big parts of the economy. And so what we've been seeing in the last week and a half or so is significant economic measures, policy measures being taken to blunt the impact of this crisis. And by some measures, they are comparable to what the US, for example, did with TARP, about 5% of the economy. Spain has mobilized up to 15 to 20% of its economy. And there's some coordination. You see this with the Fed stepping in with increased liquidity swaps, or central bank swaps to guarantee dollar liquidity in global markets. The ECB announced yesterday 750 billion euro of additional corporate and government bond purchases. And you see almost in every country that's affected some program that guarantees lending to small and medium enterprises, which are among the most affected in this crisis and key to the employment picture in many economies. So it's a pleasure to have Andrea and Alexis with us today, and they're in a position to provide real expertise. And let me start with you, Andrea, because you're on the ground in Italy, which is suffering a humanitarian catastrophe, and also was one of the first countries to go in complete shutdown of the economy in Europe. What can you say about the initial impact of the economy? What do you see in the data? And just recognizing that your comments will be very relevant to other countries, since Italy, by some measures, some public health measures, is weeks ahead of other economies.
Yes, thank you, Bart. As you said, yes, I think Italy is weeks ahead of other countries in terms of health response. The good thing is that the healthcare system here works pretty well. Therefore, we are managing a very difficult situation, but so far with no tensions or huge tensions among the population. I think the Italians are responding well. I'm currently in Rome. When you go out on the street, you simply do not meet anybody. Actually, Rome is as clean, as beautiful as I've never seen before, especially if you go in downtown. So having said that, so I think we are managing the health emergency. In terms of the economic impact, of course, this would be huge because any touristic activity is on a halt. Considered, I mean, 50% of tourism in Italy is from people abroad. So for sure, this will not materialize until, I would say, the next year. So it's not just a matter of these weeks, but my guess is that foreigners will not come to Italy for the whole year, which means 50% of tourism, which accounts, say, for 10% of our GDP. Consumption, there is no consumption. Consumption is 70% of the Italian GDP. Shops are closed, restaurants, bars, theaters, any kind of this activity. So clearly this will be extremely affected. As you know, the shutdown in Italy is foreseen until the beginning of April, but already this morning, there are rumors that school will not open before May the 6th, so another month. Actually, this is what my daughter told me. So it means that likely until say mid-May, everything will continue to be shut down. It's difficult to say how big will be the recession this first semester, but the numbers that we can have in mind are clearly double-digit drop for economic activity. The government has taken some measures, important in terms of the size for a country as Italy with a huge public debt. And this is something maybe we can come back later. And the measures go in three main directions. Manage the healthcare emergency, so hiring new doctors or building new hospitals, and which is working. I mean, hospitals are built in few weeks now, or few days, using structures that already exist. Public guarantees to SMEs to allow liquidity to the system, and tools for household incomes. So these are the three areas of policies that are put in place right now. But this is swallowing the public debt in Italy.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the debt topic is important, and perhaps we can come back to it later. Alexis, let me ask you to kind of broaden the picture and see what you're seeing in terms of the initial data for the continent, wide impact on the economy.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. It's an honor and a privilege to be with you all, and grateful that we have Andrea to speak with us from Rome on the ground. Firstly, our thoughts are definitely with you in Italy, and grateful to be able to compare notes as we face this in the US and other countries. Firstly, I think important in the policy response is, we had President Macron saying, nous sommes à la guerre, we are at war. And happily in Europe, this means not with one another. This means to counter a global pandemic. And in response to the war, we've seen the Germans call for the bazooka, Olaf Scholz. We've now seen the ECB coming back with the bigger bazooka. And I think the whole question in terms of financial markets, firstly, is this enough to quell the sell-off and the panic selling that we've seen in financial markets? I think investors are waking up to the fact that we had poor numbers in 2019 in the real economy in some sectors as a result of certain things like the tensions from the US-China trade war and the spillover effects across the Eurozone. So we had Italy potentially entering into technical recession in Q4 coming into Q1. So that's one key theme I'd like to call out, is we do have softer numbers, I would say, in certain segments and vulnerabilities in the system. I would say that as we saw the first announcements of monetary policy, firstly coming from the BOJ, then the Fed's emergency measures, Mark Carney at the Bank of England coming out with some very clear terms, and then the ECB first and second turns. What I would say is that what many are observing is that it needs to be met by creative fiscal policy. And here, Bart, you mentioned Prime Minister Sanchez in Spain. We've seen Bruno Le Maire's statements also echoing Mario Draghi's statements, using every means available. I would say that what we're seeing positively from financial and economic ministers across the Eurozone is a use of fiscal tools and policy tools to be able to help the national champions of each specific country. So looking to the German situation, export credits obviously will be significant going forward. You also mentioned the support of small to medium enterprises. I'm sitting here in the US, and it's a very different situation where we have SMEs generating 66 to 67% of employment across the Eurozone. So many are looking to the publicly listed companies here in the US. I think many will be able to look to the small to medium enterprises. I think Sanchez in Spain has also called out a very important piece of language around helping workers that to be considered temporarily suspended from work rather than completely made redundant or laid off, and the ways in which policy can really help the workers. In terms of economic growth, Andrea mentioned tourism, and one of the things I work with long-term investors to think about is, where is the future of long-term demand coming from? When coronavirus hit, in the epicenter of growth of consumption in Asia, many were concerned about a recession in Asia. And in that backdrop, it's interesting to note the extent to which, of course, Asian demand props up industry, not only in terms of Eurozone exports to China and emerging Asia, but also looking to Chinese demand propping up consumption and employment within the Eurozone, namely in terms of tourism. So obviously, what's happened in the volley going back and forth from Asia to Eurozone to the US is a halting of this type of economic activity. So here's where I would say we really are entering into a demand shock phase. This is one of the things that I think investors are mulling over, is how much can central banks, ministers of the economy and finance, stimulate people to engage in economic interactions? How long will the lag be once the quarantine and sheltering in place is actually lifted? And I think that's a big question for us going forward. Other key things, I think, just to highlight, Bart, you mentioned dollar liquidity. I think this is going to be an absolutely key issue going forward, not only across the Eurozone and Eurozone banks, but also looking to emerging market central banks and enterprises across emerging markets. Another key thing to call out is, whereas some are calling for universal basic income, handing checks to every citizen. Going back to the 1970s, that would be considered to be potentially inflationary. I think, we have to think about that going forward. We obviously have the room to raise rates should any kind of concerns around inflation arise. So with that, I will stop.
Thank you, Alexis. That was very comprehensive. I have a second question for you. I'll start with Andrea. And as I ask this and as you answer, let me remind people that have dialed in via Zoom that you can ask questions to the participants via the chat function. You have both laid out a lot of national level policies. I think we discussed Spain, Italy, the German credit guarantee through the KfW and a variety of others. Let's talk a little bit about EU economic policy response beyond what ECB is doing. And Andrea, let me ask you first. So the prospects for solidarity funds, for potential involvement of the ESM, which I know is an active debate, and going back to the comment that you made earlier about concerns about the debt levels in individual countries. Can you talk about the prospects of significantly more EU level economic policy response? And then same question for Alexa.
Thank you, Bart. Well, look, I think what has happened so far is the following. Member states delivered as much as they could, especially Italy. The ECB, I think, with last night's move, delivered pretty well. The QE in the Eurozone now is larger than the QE in the United States for 2020. What is missing is a response at the EU level, EU-wide level. The Solidarity Fund and the other funds are simply a reshuffling of money in the same pockets already available from the EU budget. So we're not talking about additional resources or additional measures. What has been done is to give a little bit more resources or power to the European Investment Bank, but it's frankly speaking a minor issue. The big issue here is whether member states are able to decide to issue Eurobonds. Eurobonds, which means not the mutualization of national debts, but an additional issue of sovereign debt or supranational debt by an EU-wide agency, that might be the ESM, to finance what? Probably to finance the post-recession phase and not the emergency, the health emergency. The reason is that in order to set up such kind of a Eurobond, you need several months because it's something that doesn't exist right now. So you need rating agencies look into it, find a European agency of debt, give the mandate to it, change some rules, and of course get a political agreement, which is not on the table so far. But I think this discussion on the Eurobond, which started 10 years ago, in 2010, the former president of the European Commission, Prodi, the former Italian finance minister, Tremonti, and the former prime minister of Luxembourg, Juncker, came out with this idea of the Eurobonds. And I think now it's time to do it. So if we want to see the EU level to act, the only thing they can really do now is to create a fiscal capacity. And the fiscal capacity can be created through the issuance of some additional debt. For the rest, what has been done by now, it's really minor thing. But look, also it's very minor what single member states did at the end of the day. If you add up all the measures taken by member states so far, it's around 1.6% of the Eurozone GDP. So this is the stimulus package we have had so far, 1.6% of the Eurozone GDP. So it's basically nothing.
Thank you, Andrea. Alexis, same question to you. And if I could ask you specifically to address, what are some of the challenges in terms of deploying the ESM's capacity in the current environment?
Okay, thank you so much. I think specifically looking to the ESM, obviously this was instituted in the last crisis, and I think at the current moment has 410 billion euros of unused capacity. I think the crucial question becomes, how is that deployed and to whom? And that has been the crucial question, I think, in some of the calls from Macron and Merkel leading up to this, to instill greater pooling and sharing and the greater consolidation across the Eurozone in terms of fiscal policy. So I think this is a clear question. When we look at the Eurozone project as a whole, we have a common monetary policy, we have very different banking system, and we have a very different fiscal culture in each country. So, we talked about the two-tier euro, we talked about the Hanseatic League, and I think these questions may come to the fore when it comes to considering how to deploy this. I think certainly using the ESM is going to quell some investor fears that, Europe is using every means available to be able to stabilize the financial system. I would also just call out to European policymakers, there's something interesting to note that I think leading up to the Corona crisis, we face a social crisis in Europe. Talking about the rise of populism, where I would say that many European citizens are questioning the ability for European countries to fulfill the social contract. And what's interesting in the kinds of responses that I'm seeing from governments, particularly the national governments, is the ability to be able to allay these social fears and to really come to the rescue of workers. And that's a crucial thing, because the last crisis, it was a crisis of banks, and I think in part led to a social crisis where people were very concerned that the bailouts were helping bankers but not workers. So I think it's crucial for politicians to be able to note that this is alleviating potentially a social crisis that was lurking obviously beneath the surface prior to this certain moment. But I think what we are going to need to see is greater cohesion. I think what we've seen from sometimes trigger points in the past, like Frankfurt versus Rome, I think are being somewhat alleviated and teased out at the moment, just out of utter necessity.
Okay, thank you, Alexis. Let me pick up on that last point about, there's also a question from Michael Rowan in the audience about, does this lead to increased populism or does it do the opposite? Does it lead to increased cohesion? And I wanted to switch to you, Andrea, your perspective from on the ground. Is this a unifying moment, or do you see fissures in the national?
Look, what I see, at least in my country, is that this is a unified moment. Politicians from both sides are quite, I would say, aligned right now. Of course, there is some debate, but it's minor issue. I think people are discovering once again the importance of national institutions, the importance of having some centralization, for instance, in managing healthcare emergencies. And also there is not an anti-Europe sentiment so far. And probably the reason is that there are no countries that are in a better shape. We are all on the same boat now. It's true that the numbers in terms of the healthcare emergency are different across countries, but the feeling is that this depends on the way you record these numbers, and not really because of huge differences as we see in the numbers between Italy and other countries. So the feeling is that we are all in the same boat. There is no anti-Europe sentiment. There is no one which is fueling on it, and there is a national unity and national sentiment that now I see in my compatriots, which is a good thing. But it shows that also Italy is a country that usually during emergencies behave well. It gives its best in this situation.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. Let's get back to economic policy. Alexis, I wanted to ask you a series of fairly specific questions about the ECB. It obviously has rolled out a number of initiatives, the LTRO in support of small and medium enterprise lending, the expanded asset purchase program, and it's historically on record as saying it would buy as many member state sovereign bonds as needed. How do you assess their overall response, and what else would you comment on in terms of their role in the current environment?
Yeah, I think, thank you. I think it's interesting to note the words that have moved markets since 2008 have been central bankers' comments. It has not necessarily been the trade wars introducing a little bit of volatility. In fact, what has quelled markets has been, the Fed stepping in to be able to halt the path to policy normalization. So here we are, I think, where everyone was waiting with bated breath to see what would happen. We mentioned like Kuroda moving first, I think, and Japan obviously having been hit hardest the first. The Fed jumping in with this emergency moment. I actually was awake in the middle of the night on a Sunday night wondering why Christine Lagarde hadn't jumped in yet and the way she did. And I think Obviously, she's faced a lot of criticism, and Frankfurt as a whole has faced a lot of criticism for not committing enough. Various reasons for that, potentially. I think the UK may come under fire for doing the same thing, not the BOE, but the British government to begin with. I think many were looking for the famous 2012 speech from Mario Draghi that I will do whatever it takes to keep the Eurozone and the Euro together. And now I think echoing Andrea's solidarity that has been spoken by different national leaders, I think what came in overnight has helped a lot of investors seek a little bit of pause that the ECB will go to any lengths and buy as many bonds as they need to. But the question becomes, to what extent can that really compel and coerce people to engage in economic interactions in our largely consumption-driven economies? Would be one question I have. The other question would be around, Martin Wolf brilliantly wrote in the last few days a piece that central banks cannot deliver solvency. Mm-hmm. So we do have huge vulnerabilities in the system. If we look at bank price to book ratios for Eurozone banks vis-a-vis their American counterparts, it's a very paltry and vulnerable story leading up to this Corona crisis. You also have the contagion effect potentially of the issue of non-financial corporate debt and European exposure to non-financial corporate debt in the US. So that's just another key, I think, vulnerability to point out. I think going forward, many will be focused on this banking fragility and the extent to which the ECB can be able to help to address that, whether it's in conjunction with the ESM, and the support, as we mentioned, continuing and deepening the support across the board for SMEs with TLR TROs.
One final question for both of you. And Andrea, you're affiliated with a major investor. Alexis, you, as your day job, give investors advice in disruptive environments. With markets being as they are, what is the single piece of advice that both of you would give? Perhaps Alexis first.
Sure, I would say that distinguishing between the public markets and the real economy, there's going to be a discount buying moment to be had, and particularly with distressed assets, and I think that's going to be sectorially concentrated. Whether or not those assets are currently in a situation with vulnerable balance sheets or whether or not they're under secular distress, I think is going to be an interesting one to point out. I have advised investors to consolidate your position, deal with your organizational issues first, because I think many are concerned about the health and the public health issue and the public health crisis and helping their employees, their portfolio companies. And then be able to consolidate my position and say, well, what am I long on? And if I'm looking at the Eurozone, am I still long on tourism? Am I still long on consumption? Am I still long on infrastructure? I think where we've had Bruno Le Maire talking about potential nationalizations, I think eventually once things stabilize, there will still be a right moment for privatizations. And so which countries look the most positive, I think, going forward. So I would be consolidating and really having a deep and profound conversation with myself and my partners about what would be my long-term conviction themes.
Thank you, Andrea.
Well, Bart, I currently work for a public institution, so I cannot, and I don't want to give any advice to investors, even because every time I give an advice to myself, I make mistakes. So it's better not to advise. But what I see is probably there will be a new positive season for the private equity market, especially in Europe, where you will have a lot of good, exceptional, I would say, middle-sized companies, which are usually family-owned, that will look and will seek for partners coming from private equity, because they will be over-indebted, likely, and undercapitalized. So if they should give us, a suggestion is for private equity to start looking at Europe and find good companies because there are many. As you probably know, Bart, I'm also chairman of a private equity fund in Italy, which is called Italian Investment Fund. And what I said to my colleagues in the firm is, look, we'll have a good season in the next 2 or 3 years because we can buy good companies at a cheap price and help entrepreneurs to become bigger and stronger.
Thank you both. We have a question from the audience about defense spending specifically, and if there's any initial talk about what this means, European defense spending, EU defense initiatives, and progress towards the Wales Pledge for NATO-related spending. Andrea, is there anything in, let's start with Italy, in domestic Italian politics where that has come up yet?
Well, look, to be honest, currently there is no discussion in Europe about this. Everyone is concentrated, is focused on the healthcare emergency, and therefore, I think this is a secondary issue now. I understand that for Americans is extremely relevant because of the NATO spending, but I think now resources and member states are trying to find out ways to finance the humanitarian emergency and the health emergency.
Okay, thank you. That's right.
Having said that, it might be that in the future, once this is over, if Europe decide to move towards a more cooperative approach, then they can go further in integrating their defense systems.
Thank you. Alexis, a question from the audience about supply chains. I'll introduce it. The contrast here is with the U.S.-Canada situation. There was the border closure announced yesterday, but with an agreement to maintain critical supply chains and keep trade going. In the relationship between the EU and North America or the U.S., have you seen policy planning around contingency plan and security of critical supply chains?
Thank you. I think, firstly, I think the big supply shock obviously came from China to inputs coming across the Eurozone. So we've seen auto manufacturers immediately have to shutter. I think that was certainly the biggest shock to the system in terms of Eurozone GDP growth. I think now what we're seeing is just absolute scrambling to be able to address shortage issues. But I think first and foremost, it's the ability to stop the public health crisis. And I think that's at the forefront of everyone's minds, more important than anything else. So we have seen some commitments that you will be able to continue to move goods, just not people. I've been thinking myself about the cargo elements of aircraft, how long it's going to take to move goods when you are not moving aircraft across the oceans to support people. So I think, that's one critical issue. But I think many companies will struggle to be able to have inventories met.
Okay, thank you. I have a follow-up question about from the audience. Andrea, you mentioned Euro bonds. We had the discussion about increased solidarity within Italy. The question is, as a follow-up, is there a sense that there would be increased intra-European solidarity or pro-EU sentiment? And is that something, Andrea, that you're seeing, or Alexis, is that something that you've picked up on?
Look, can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't see big changes so far. Each country is still handling the issue, the problem by itself. The real way to see solidarity is when we'll have key decisions taken at EU-wide level. So far, each country is trying to manage the emergency, closing frontier barrier, putting barriers, and trying to use nationwide tools. So there is no anti-Europe sentiment, but I cannot say there is EU-wide solidarity.
Thank you, Andrea. Alexis, any comments on that question?
Yeah, I think just watching the language around Schengen, I mean, Schengen was something that was summarily slammed on the table with the Brexit referendum and has been tossed around for the last almost 4 years, and the value of it. And I think, you're seeing a lot of fear-based declarations or concerns around Schengen. When you do seal borders to be able to contain a public health crisis, I think people probably shouldn't take it personally, that this is more of a policy move to be able to stunt the growth in cases and so-called flatten the curve. I think we are at a crucial moment, kind of coming back to my earlier comments on Europe addressing the social crisis and potentially underlying social crisis that predated this. And I am seeing, as I mentioned, culturally specific but similar moves from all the finance and economic ministers. So I think the ways in which this is communicated to people once the public health crisis has alleviated somewhat and we flatten the curve, God willing, I think that's going to be crucial. And the ways in which, of course, the media translates it as well for people is going to be really crucial because, really what I'm seeing is governments coming to the rescue of workers. And that's something that was lacking, I think, although maybe potentially intention in the last crisis.
Thank you both. Again, as a reminder to the audience, if you do have a question with Zoom, you can send them via chat. With Facebook, you can send them in the comments section. I have a question going back to Eurobonds, which Andrea, you started the discussion on Eurobonds and noted how that's an idea that originated in the European debt crisis. They are controversial and would need active discussion. They're being criticized, obviously, by many. What are the prospects? And I'll ask both of you to comment on this. What are the real prospects of a fiscal burden sharing mechanism like Eurobonds coming off the ground in response to this crisis?
Can I start, Bart?
Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
And I have only 2% of battery in my iPad, so in case I have to switch on the mobile. Anyway, it's I would say yesterday I was very confident. Today I'm a little bit less confident because the ECB move can be an excuse for governments not to do more on fiscal EU fiscal capacity. So let's see what happens in the coming weeks. Having said that, each country in Europe, apart from Germany, has now a public debt which is higher than what it was in 2008. And the same is in the United States, as you know. So in Europe, the fiscal capacity for single member states is much more limited than in the past, with the exception of Germany. Therefore, if you have to do huge investment plans, huge recovery from a deep recession, national budgets are not sufficient. And therefore, either there is a EU-wide fiscal capacity, or there will be very difficult for Europe to recover, and especially to boost economic growth in the coming years. That's the reason why I think Eurobonds is a solution. If it is well designed, and it's not a huge thing, it can be something absolutely manageable. You might remember that the Atlantic Council came out 2 or 3 years ago with a report mentioning this Eurobond, saying that they might be 3% of the Eurozone budget. So 3% of the Eurozone GDP. So 3% of the Eurozone's GDP is really a minor thing for financial markets, but with the current rates and with the current needs, this can be really a game changer.
Thank you. Alexis, comments on Eurobonds?
Sure. I mean, I think going back to 2 key things, one would be that Corona crisis compounding the 2019 numbers. And so, what was not removed was the I think the very sharp relationship between Frankfurt and Rome going into this situation. Very different fiscal cultures from the north to the south. So I don't think that's going to go away. Obviously, some countries will be more willing than others to be able to support Italy in its current situation. I just don't see that, unfortunately, disappearing. We do know, going back to Wolfgang Schäuble and the Schwarz Null, we do know that the word for debt in German also means guilt. So I think you're going to see probably very different contrasting policies. So, on the one side, we have opportunity for greater cohesion and consolidation. I think on the other side, you will continue to see that different fiscal cultures exacerbating or inhibiting the ability for complete protection of economic growth going forward and recovery.
Okay, thank you both. We're almost out of time. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Remind everybody to stay inside, wash your hands. Let me give both speakers a brief opportunity for a final statement. And if you wouldn't mind in your brief comments, give us a sense of what you're looking at in terms of inform your view on how this will play out as an economic scenario. We're getting the question, is this V-shaped, L-shaped, U-shaped? What kind of recession, what kind of depression? What are you looking for in the early data to inform your judgment on that? And then we'll wrap up after.
Bart, what I see is a first semester extremely negative in Europe, likely in the United States, with numbers that we have never seen, probably in war times. I don't know. The question, the big question, I think, is whether there will be a same size recovery after that. But I think what we'll have in the first, second quarter, because especially for Europe is in between the two quarters, March, April, May, will be minus 20, I don't know, minus 30% of GDP activity, something as big as these numbers. Hopefully with a huge recovery after that. We'll see.
Thank you. Alexis, final comments?
Yes, I've been very dubious of this elusive V-shaped recovery. I feel as much too sanguine and rosy since we began the discussions on this a couple months ago, monitoring China. Partly because this is not just supply shock. It's not just automotive manufacturers not being able to get parts out of China. It is crucially, it is a demand shock, and it's a demand shock to where employment and wage growth was growing fastest, leisure and hospitality, tourism across the board in some of these advanced economies. So you really are shooting the new economy in the foot. I'm with Andrea. I think you see the potential for jaw-dropping negative growth figures across the Eurozone, particularly in the largest economies, which ironically are the ones that have been hardest hit. Don't know if we include the UK in the Eurozone nowadays or in the European discussion. I don't know if that's taboo or not, but I would say that when, again, I think another key issue for the recovery, which again, I don't see as being V-shaped, is I think this is going to put companies, financial and non-financial, that have been irresponsible in terms of their credit issuance and leverage situation, balance sheet situation, under significant duress. And so whereas we've talked the morning about all of the policy measures that are being put together, I think that you're going to see pain where there's a lot of vulnerabilities, defaulting, delinquency, bankruptcies, etc. That goes for households as well as for companies. So those, I think, will be the hardest hit and may prolong a significant recovery.
Thank you, Alexis. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up. Thank you for joining us at the Atlantic Council. As Ben Haddad indicated at the beginning, we are through Zoom and other ways trying to connect with you and trying to stay informative to you. So thank you for joining. Stay inside, wash your hands, and hopefully see you soon.